I was still wearing the neck brace from my car accident when my stepsister decided to make a point. We were at my father's house 2 days after his funeral. I was arranging flowers when Catherine walked up behind me. I didn't see her hands coming. She grabbed my neck brace and twisted it tight. I gasped. My airway closed. My vision blurred at the edges. "A stepchild like you thinks you can fight me for the inheritance," she hissed into my ear, her breath hot against my skin. I clawed at the brace, desperate for air. My knees buckled. I hit the floor hard. And the room. They laughed. My stepmother, Janet. The cousins. Someone actually chuckled like it was dinner theater. No one helped me. Not one person. I lay there on the cold tile, tears streaming down my face, thinking, this is my family. This is what I am to them. But what Catherine didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my father had left something behind. Something that would change everything in exactly 1 week. Have you ever been humiliated by the people who were supposed to protect you? My name is Lindsay Donovan. I'm 35 years old, a financial analyst who spent the last decade building a career from nothing, with no help from the people who were supposed to be my family. Everything I have, I earned myself. I learned early that relying on others, especially the ones sharing my last name, would only lead to disappointment. When my father passed away, I drove 6 hours to attend his funeral. Part of me hoped that death might do what life never could bring us together, if only for a few days of shared mourning. I was wrong. Janet, my stepmother of 22 years, met me at the front door like I was a solicitor she hadn't ordered. No embrace, no tears, just a thin smile and words that landed like a slap. "Your old room has been converted to storage. You can sleep in the guest room." She said it casually, as though informing me about a minor scheduling change. I stood in the doorway of the house where I'd spent my childhood holding my overnight bag, and understood immediately that nothing had changed. I wasn't a grieving daughter returning home. I was an inconvenience. The funeral arrangements consumed the first day, but dinner that evening revealed the family dynamics in full color. Janet sat at the head of the table, my father's chair I noticed, and held court with relatives I barely recognized. My stepsister Catherine positioned herself at Janet's right hand, her green eyes scanning the room with barely concealed satisfaction. I'd always found it strange that Catherine looked nothing like my father. Her auburn hair and fair complexion were so different from his dark features and mine. But I assumed she simply took after Janet and never questioned it further. The conversation turned to my father's final months, and suddenly I was on trial. "We were here every single day caring for him," Janet announced to the table loud enough for everyone to hear. "Feeding him, bathing him, managing his medications. It was exhausting." She paused, letting her gaze drift to me. "Some of us had other priorities, of course." Catherine jumped in eagerly. "Some people only show up when there's something to gain." I felt my face burn. The relatives shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing in my defense. Years of carefully constructed narrative had already convicted me, Lindsay, the absent daughter. Lindsay, the selfish one. Lindsay, who abandoned her father for her career. Never mind that Janet had spent years making my visits unwelcome. Never mind the phone calls that went unreturned the holidays, where I was told the house is too crowded this year. I noticed something odd as I excused myself from the table security cameras installed in the hallway, new and sleek. My father had always complained about technology, refused to even own a smartphone. Why would he suddenly install a surveillance system? The next morning, preparing for the funeral, my neck brace became their new target. I'd been in a minor car accident 2 weeks earlier, and the doctor insisted I wear it for support. Janet looked at me like I'd arrived in costume. "Do you really have to wear that thing? It makes everything look so dramatic." Catherine didn't even try to hide her contempt. Classic Lindsay, always finding a way to be the center of attention. Their cruelty shouldn't have surprised me anymore, but what happened next shattered every assumption I'd ever made about this family. The attack, Catherine's hands on my brace, the choking, the laughter, and then lying in the guest room that night with ice pressed against my swollen throat, I couldn't stop replaying her words. Not, "You don't deserve any money," which would have been cruel but predictable. Instead, she'd hissed something stranger. "You were never really part of this family." Why those specific words? Why did they feel less like an insult and more like a warning? What did Catherine know that I didn't? That question haunted me for weeks. I returned to my apartment after the funeral, but Catherine's words followed me like a shadow. You were never really part of this family. The more I turned it over in my mind, the more certain I became that she meant something specific, something beyond ordinary cruelty. I tried to move forward. I went back to work, attended meetings, analyzed spreadsheets, but every night I found myself staring at the ceiling, feeling the phantom pressure of that neck brace tightening around my throat. The bruises faded, but the memory didn't. Then the phone calls started. My cousin Margaret called first, her voice hesitant and strange. Lindsay, I just wanted to check on you. Janet mentioned you've been having a hard time since your accident. She said you've been acting a little erratic. I told Margaret I was fine, confused by the concern in her voice. A few days later, my Uncle Robert called with similar questions. Had I been feeling okay? Was I sleeping? Janet had mentioned I seemed unstable at the funeral. I understood then what was happening. Janet wasn't just dismissing me anymore. She was building a narrative, calling relatives one by one, planting seeds of doubt about my mental state. By the time any legal questions arose about my father's estate, the entire family would already believe I was too fragile, too unreliable, too desperate to be taken seriously. Catherine took a more direct approach. She sent me a text message that read like a legal threat, dressed in sisterly concern. I heard you've been telling people a different version of what happened at the funeral. I want to remind you that defamation is a serious matter. I have multiple witnesses who saw you cause a scene. If you continue spreading lies, I will take legal action. She had witnesses, she said. The same people who laughed while I choked on the floor. I made the mistake of calling Janet directly, hoping to discuss the estate like rational adults. I wanted to know about funeral expenses, about my father's accounts, about the house. She cut me off before I finished my first sentence. We handled absolutely everything while you were absent for years, Lindsay. Every doctor's appointment, every medication and refill, every sleepless night. Don't suddenly pretend to care now that there might be money involved. She hung up before I could respond. For a moment I considered giving up. Maybe they were right. Maybe I had been absent and this was the price. Maybe fighting would only make things worse. Then I ran into Helen. It happened at a grocery store 3 weeks after the funeral. I was reaching for a box of tea when I heard someone say my name. I turned and saw a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and gray hair, pulled back in a neat bun. It took me a moment to recognize her. Helen Morrison. She had been my father's caregiver for 15 years, a constant presence in his life during all the years I felt pushed away. I remembered her fondly from my rare visits, always warm, always welcoming, when Janet was cold. I was hoping I might see you, Helen said quietly, glancing around as if someone might be watching. I've been thinking about you since the funeral. There are things I need to tell you. We found a quiet corner near the pharmacy section, and Helen told me everything. She had been fired 2 months before my father died. Janet claimed her services were no longer needed, but Helen believed the real reason was different. Your father was changing in those last months, she explained. He was getting paranoid, but not in a confused way. More like he was scared of something specific. He started hiding things from Janet. He even installed a camera in his office because he thought someone was going through his papers. My heart began to pound. Did he say what he was afraid of? Helen leaned closer. He told me something the week before Janet let me go. He grabbed my hand and said, Helen, if anything happens to me, make sure Lindsay knows to check under my desk, the secret compartment. He made me repeat it back to him twice. I felt the floor shift beneath my feet. My father had left something for me, something he didn't want Janet to find. Helen wasn't finished. I tried to call you after the funeral, but your number had changed. I didn't know how to reach you. I've been carrying this around for months, wondering if I should go to the police, wondering if I was making too much of it. She paused, her eyes filling with tears. I loved your father, Lindsay. He was a good man. And whatever Janet and Catherine are doing, he didn't want it. I'm sure of that. I thanked Helen and took her phone number, promising to stay in touch. Then I drove straight to my father's house and parked down the street waiting. It took 3 hours before Janet's car pulled out of the driveway, followed by Catherine's SUV. I watched them disappear around the corner, then approached the house using the spare key I had kept hidden in my wallet for years. The study looked the same as it always had. Books on the shelves, papers on the desk, the faint smell of pipe tobacco that never quite faded. I knelt beside the desk and felt along the underside until my fingers found a small latch. A panel clicked open, revealing a shallow compartment I never knew existed. Inside was a USB drive. I took it home and opened it on my laptop with shaking hands. The drive contained several audio files and one video file that was password protected. I played the audio first. My father's voice filled the room, tired and strained, speaking about pressure and being forced to make decisions I don't want to make. He mentioned feeling watched, feeling trapped. He said he was documenting everything in case something happens. I couldn't unlock the video file no matter what passwords I tried, but I had enough to know that something was very wrong with the official story of my father's final months. The next morning, I visited an estate lawyer and handed over the USB drive for professional analysis. I also went to the police station and filed a formal assault report about the neck brace incident. I brought my medical records showing the injuries to my throat and neck. I mentioned the security cameras Janet had installed, the ones that might have captured everything. The officer took detailed notes and promised to investigate. I told no one about any of this. Not Helen, not my cousins, no one. But somehow Janet found out about the lawyer. Her next phone call came with a different tone entirely. Gone was the dismissive condescension. In its place was something harder, almost desperate. "Whatever you think you're doing, Lindsay, it won't work. Everyone knows you abandoned your father. No one will believe your word over ours." Catherine chimed in during a separate call. "We have documentation proving Dad wanted us to handle everything. You have nothing but desperation." But beneath the threats, I heard something new in their voices. Fear. Real fear. They weren't just protecting an inheritance. They were protecting something else, something bigger than money. That night my lawyer called. His voice was unusually serious, almost grim. "Lindsay, I finally accessed the locked video file. You need to come to my office first thing tomorrow morning. Clear your entire schedule." He paused, and I could hear him choosing his next words carefully. "I need you to answer honestly. Are you physically safe staying where you are right now?" I barely slept that night. The lawyer's question echoed in my mind until dawn. Was I physically safe? The fact that he felt the need to ask told me everything about what he had seen on that video file. I checked into a hotel before sunrise and waited for morning. His office was downtown on the 8th floor of a building with gray carpets and fluorescent lights. He met me in the lobby himself, which struck me as unusual. His name was David Chen, a man in his 50s with silver hair and a calm demeanor that probably served him well in contentious estate cases. But today, his calm seemed strained. He led me to a conference room and closed the door before speaking. "The video file on your father's USB drive," he said carefully, "contains footage that fundamentally changes this case. I've already contacted the authorities and arranged for the will reading to proceed this afternoon. I need you to be prepared for what's coming." He wouldn't show me the video yet. He said it would be better to reveal everything at once in front of everyone with proper witnesses present. I trusted his judgment, though the waiting felt unbearable. The will reading was scheduled for 2 o'clock. I arrived early and sat in the conference room alone, a thick folder of documents beside me. Everything I had gathered over the past weeks was in that folder. Medical records, photographs, Helen's written statement, the police report number. I had spent years being this family's punching bag, their convenient scapegoat for every problem. Today that performance would end permanently. Janet and Catherine arrived precisely on time, dressed in expensive black clothing that probably cost more than my monthly rent. They looked like grieving widows from a magazine, spread all dignity and restrained sorrow. Catherine slid into the chair across from me and reached over to pat my hand with theatrical sympathy. "Lindsay, I really hope we can finally put our differences aside and honor Dad's true wishes together. This is what he would have wanted." Her smile was perfect. Her eyes were ice. I said nothing and pulled my hand away. Janet settled beside her daughter, arranging her designer purse just so. She didn't acknowledge me at all, which was somehow worse than Catherine's fake warmth. To Janet, I had already been dismissed. I was simply an obstacle to be managed, then forgotten. The lawyer entered with a paralegal and closed the door. He spread documents across the table methodically, his face revealing nothing. Janet watched him with the confidence of someone who already knew the outcome. She had submitted my father's will months ago, the one that left nearly everything to her and Catherine. She had no reason to expect any complications. "Before we begin," the lawyer said. "I need to address some irregularities that emerged during our review of Mr. Donovan's estate." Janet's smile flickered slightly. "Irregularities. The will you submitted for probate. Mrs. Donovan cannot be legally validated." The lawyer's voice was level, almost gentle. "Medical records obtained during our investigation clearly demonstrate that Mr. Donovan lacked the mental capacity required to execute legal documents at the time that will was signed. His dementia diagnosis and documented cognitive decline make this indisputable under state law." Catherine shot to her feet. "That's absolutely impossible. He told us explicitly what he wanted. We were there when he signed it." "Please sit down, Ms. Donovan." The lawyer waited until she complied, her face flushed with anger. "The last legally binding will signed 2 years prior, when Mr. Donovan was still fully lucid and competent, leaves 70% of the estate directly to his daughter Lindsay." The room went silent. I watched Janet's carefully composed face freeze mid-expression like a mask that had suddenly cracked. 20 years of planning. 20 years of pushing me away, of poisoning my relationship with my father, of building a narrative that made me the villain, all of it collapsing in seconds. "Furthermore," the lawyer continued, "we commissioned an independent handwriting analysis of the newer will. The expert's conclusion is that the signature shows clear signs of coercion and guided writing. Someone physically moved Mr. Donovan's hand." Catherine opened her mouth to argue, but before she could speak, her phone buzzed loudly against the table. She glanced at the screen, and I watched the color drain from her face completely. She looked like she might be sick. "I need to... The police want me to come to the station immediately." Janet's head snapped toward her daughter. "What? Why?" The lawyer answered for her. "Ms. Donovan, the assault report that Lindsay filed several weeks ago has completed its investigation. The security cameras installed in Mr. Donovan's home captured the incident at the funeral in complete detail." He paused, letting that sink in. "The footage clearly shows you attacking Lindsay's neck brace while she was recovering from injuries. The police have classified it as assault. I remembered those cameras in the hallway, the ones I thought were strange for a man who hated technology. Janet had installed them to monitor my father. She never imagined they would capture her daughter's cruelty instead. But the lawyer wasn't finished. During our examination of the estate's finances, we discovered additional concerns. Approximately $150,000 was withdrawn from Mr. Donovan's accounts over the past year without proper authorization. The transactions trace back to accounts controlled by Mrs. Donovan and her daughter." Janet's composure finally shattered. "Those were legitimate expenses. Medical care, household costs, everything was for Robert's benefit. We also discovered," the lawyer continued, as if she hadn't spoken, "that Mrs. Donovan currently owes approximately $200,000 in gambling debts to various creditors, and Ms. Catherine Donovan has accumulated roughly $80,000 in personal credit card debt." He looked up from his notes. "The financial motive for manipulating Mr. Donovan's estate planning is quite clear." The conference room felt airless. I looked at Janet and Catherine and finally understood the complete picture. This was never about family loyalty. This was never about caring for a sick father or honoring his wishes. This was pure financial desperation. They had been drowning in debt, and my father's estate was their lifeline. They would have done anything to keep me away from it. They did do anything. The lawyer dimmed the lights and turned on a screen mounted on the wall. "There is one more matter. The USB drive that Lindsay provided contained a video file her father recorded in his home office." The footage began to play. My father appeared on screen, sitting at his desk, his hands trembling visibly. He looked frail, confused, nothing like the strong man I remembered from my childhood. Catherine entered the frame and snatched papers from his weak grip. She forced a pen into his unsteady hand. Janet stood behind him, arms crossed, her voice cold and impatient through the speakers. "Just sign the documents, Robert. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." My father's voice came through next, fragile and lost. "Where's Lindsay?" "I want to talk to Lindsay first. I want her here for this." Catherine's response was harsh. "She doesn't care about you, Dad. She's never cared. She abandoned you years ago. Now just sign it." I couldn't stop the tears, not tears of anger or vindication, Tears of grief for a father who never stopped loving me, who asked for me even when they told him I didn't care. They had kept us apart deliberately. They had made him believe I abandoned him, and he still wanted me there. Catherine was escorted out by building security to meet the police waiting downstairs. Janet sat motionless in her chair, staring at nothing, her empire of lies crumbling visibly around her. The lawyer began gathering his documents, then paused. One more thing. Your father left a sealed personal letter with specific instructions. It's only to be opened after all legal matters are fully resolved. He placed a plain white envelope on the table in front of me. I looked at my name, written in my father's handwriting. What secret had he been protecting? What truth couldn't he speak while he was alive? The weeks that followed the will reading brought revelation after revelation, each one peeling back another layer of deception I never knew existed. I kept my father's sealed letter in my desk drawer unopened, waiting as my lawyer advised. But every night I found myself staring at that plain white envelope, wondering what secrets it contained. Catherine was formally charged with assault within days of the will reading. The security camera footage was undeniable. You could see everything clearly. Her hands grabbing my neck brace, my body crumpling to the floor, the family standing around doing nothing. Her lawyer tried to argue it was a misunderstanding, a moment of grief-fueled poor judgment, but the video told a different story. The prosecutor called it deliberate and premeditated, but the assault charge was only the beginning. The financial investigation that followed exposed a pattern of fraud stretching back years. Catherine had been living a life I couldn't have imagined. Designer handbags that cost more than my monthly salary, vacations to Europe and the Caribbean, a closet full of clothes with tags still attached. Her social media accounts, which investigators subpoenaed, showed a woman living like an heiress long before any inheritance was settled. The money for all of it came from my father's accounts. Investigators traced withdrawals going back at least 5 years, small amounts, at first, then larger and larger as his mental state declined. Catherine had apparently justified this to herself as accessing family money that would eventually be hers anyway. She was just taking her inheritance early, she probably told herself. Meanwhile, I had worked for every dollar I ever earned, never asking my father for anything, never knowing that his accounts were being systematically drained by the people living under his roof. When investigators confronted Catherine with the paper trail, she turned on her mother instantly. Janet told me exactly what to do, she claimed during her interrogation. Every step of the way. She said Dad would never notice the withdrawals because of his condition. She said it was fine, but the documentation told a different story. Bank records showed Catherine making withdrawals herself, signing her own name, transferring funds to her own accounts. She wasn't a manipulated victim. She was a fully willing participant who got caught. Janet's situation was even worse. The investigation revealed gambling debts totaling nearly $200,000 money she had been secretly borrowing against the house my father owned. She had been making minimum payments to keep creditors quiet, probably praying for a big win that never came. Without control of my father's estate, she faced complete financial ruin. That explained the desperation. That explained why they needed me gone so badly. I wasn't just an inconvenient stepdaughter to them. I was standing between Janet and the money she needed to survive. Neighbors began coming forward with their own accounts. An elderly woman from 3 houses down described seeing Janet standing over my father at his desk, speaking harshly while he signed papers with shaking hands. He looked so confused, she told investigators. I asked Janet if everything was all right, and she just smiled and said they were handling some routine paperwork, but his eyes looked frightened. Another neighbor reported hearing arguments through open windows. Janet's voice raised my father's voice, pleading. The most painful discovery came from the investigation into household records. My letters to my father over the years, the ones that went unanswered, had never reached him at all. Janet had controlled all incoming mail during his illness. She intercepted my cards, my notes, my attempts to reconnect, and she told my father repeatedly that I never wrote, never called, never cared about him. She manufactured my absence and then used it as proof that I was a bad daughter. All those years I thought he was choosing not to respond. All those years I believed he had sided with Janet, that he didn't want me in his life anymore. It was all a lie. Janet had built a wall between us, brick by brick, and I never even knew it existed. Then Ruth called. Ruth was my father's younger sister, a woman I remembered fondly from childhood. but had barely seen in 2 decades. She had always seemed uncomfortable around Janet, always quiet at family gatherings, always leaving early. I assumed she simply didn't like me. The truth was far more complicated. I was terrified of Janet for so long, Ruth admitted, her voice heavy with guilt. She made it absolutely clear to everyone that anyone who openly supported you would be completely cut off from your brother. I was a coward, Lindsay. I chose access to my brother over doing what was right for you. I will never forgive myself for that. Ruth told me she had once witnessed Janet forging my father's signature on a substantial check. She was too afraid to report it, too afraid to even mention it. Janet had that effect on people. She could make you feel like challenging her would cost you everything. But then Ruth said something that stopped my heart. There's something else, something I've suspected for many years, but never had proof of. She paused, and I could hear her struggling with the words. Your father changed profoundly after Catherine was born. He became quieter, sadder in a fundamental way, more withdrawn from everyone. I always thought he discovered something about Janet that completely broke his heart, but he never told anyone what it was. He just carried it alone for all those years. Ruth's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Whatever that truth is, Lindsay, I believe he finally wrote it down, in that sealed letter he left for you. The legal proceedings advanced steadily over the following weeks. The courts validated my father's legitimate will, the one he signed when he was still lucid and competent. I received full legal control of his estate. Janet and Catherine faced mounting charges, elder financial abuse, coercion, assault, fraud, and forgery. The family Janet had spent 20 years carefully constructing on manipulation and lies was crumbling with each new court filing. Through all of this, the sealed letter sat on my desk, waiting. My lawyer had advised patience, suggesting I wait until the legal situation fully stabilized before opening it. There might be information inside that could complicate the proceedings, he said. Better to wait. But Ruth's words echoed constantly in my mind. Something completely broke his heart. What did my father discover 20 years ago? What truth was so painful that he carried it silently and alone until the day he died? What couldn't he bring himself to tell me while he was alive? The night before Janet's preliminary hearing, I couldn't wait any longer. I sat at my desk, the envelope in my hands, and carefully broke the seal. The paper inside was covered in my father's familiar handwriting. The letters slightly shaky, but still legible. The first line made my breath catch in my throat. My dearest Lindsay, there's something I should have told you 20 years ago, but I was too much of a coward to face the consequences. I'm so deeply sorry. Let me explain everything. I read those words again to make sure I understood them correctly. Then I continued reading, and the truth my father had hidden for 20 years finally came to light. The letter explained that 20 years ago, shortly after Catherine was born, my father discovered evidence of Janet's affair with a colleague from her office. He found receipts, messages, photographs hidden in a drawer Janet thought he would never open. The betrayal alone would have been devastating enough, but what came next shattered him completely. He arranged for DNA testing, in secret telling Janet he needed blood work for insurance purposes. The results confirmed what he had begun to suspect from the moment he saw those hidden photographs. Catherine was not his biological daughter. My father confronted Janet with everything he knew. She broke down completely, he wrote. She begged him not to leave, not to tell anyone, especially not Catherine, who was completely innocent in all of this. Janet swore the affair was over, that it had meant nothing, that she had made a terrible mistake she would regret forever. She said exposing the truth would destroy Catherine's entire identity and sense of self. The child had done nothing wrong. Why should she suffer for her mother's sins? So my father made a choice. He stayed. He stayed silent. He thought he was protecting everyone from pain. But that silence extracted a terrible price from all of us, especially me. Janet lived in constant fear of exposure for the next 20 years. That fear made her controlling, desperate, paranoid. She favored Catherine obsessively, partly from guilt over her betrayal, and partly to ensure Catherine never questioned her place in the family. And she systematically pushed me away because I was a living reminder of everything Janet wanted to forget. I was the only biological child, the only one with a legitimate claim to my father's love, his name, his legacy. My very existence threatened the lie at the center of their family. My father wrote that he watched Janet slowly turn me into an outsider in my own home, and he said nothing to stop it because he was afraid. Afraid of confrontation, afraid of destroying Catherine, afraid of being alone. His silence, he wrote, was his greatest failure as my father. I deserve so much better than what he gave me. The letter ended with words I will carry with me for the rest of my life. You were always my true daughter, Lindsay, the one who inherited my values and my character, not just my name. I'm leaving everything to you because I trust you to do what's right with it. I love you. I always did, even when I couldn't show it. Forgive me. I sat at my desk and cried for a long time after finishing that letter. Not from anger, though I had every right to be angry. I cried for my father trapped in a marriage built on lies. I cried for the little girl I used to be, always wondering why she wasn't good enough. I cried for all the years we lost, because one woman's fear poisoned everything it touched. The legal proceedings concluded 6 months after the investigation began. Both Janet and Catherine took plea deals rather than face trial. The evidence against them was simply too overwhelming to fight. The video footage, the financial records, the witness statements, the forged documents. Their lawyers advised them to negotiate while they still could. Catherine's attorney argued that she had been acting under her mother's influence and manipulation her entire life. The judge considered this but noted that Catherine was a grown woman who made her own choices. She received 2 years of supervised probation plus 200 hours of mandatory community service for assault and financial fraud. She would have a criminal record for the rest of her life. Janet's sentence was harsher. Her plea deal required her to forfeit any remaining claim to my father's estate and pay substantial restitution for what she had stolen. The judge sentenced her to 2 years in state prison for elder financial abuse, coercion, and forgery. When the verdict was read, Janet showed no remorse, only bitter anger at being caught after so many years of successful manipulation. She glared at me across the courtroom like I was the one who had wronged her. Catherine broke down completely during the sentencing. Afterward, in the hallway outside the courtroom, she grabbed my arm and demanded to know what my father had written in his letter. Her eyes were wild, desperate. I think part of her already knew. Part of her had always known something was wrong. I told her the truth quietly, about the affair, about the DNA test, about Catherine not being my father's biological daughter. She screamed that it was lies, desperate fabrication, a final act of cruelty from a dead man who had never loved her. But somewhere deep in her eyes, I saw a flicker of recognition. A lifetime of small questions finally answered in the worst possible way. Why did she look so different from our father? Why did Janet always seem so anxious about keeping the family together? Why was pushing me away so important? The family. Janet spent 20 years building on deception ended exactly the way it was always destined to end, in ruins. I sold my father's house a few months later. I couldn't live there, not with all those memories soaked into the walls. But I kept his antique desk, the one with the secret compartment where he hid the USB drive that ultimately saved me. I put it in my apartment where I could see it every day. I used a significant portion of my inheritance to establish the Robert Donovan Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting elderly victims of family financial abuse. It felt right transforming my father's guilt and my own pain into something that could help others facing similar betrayals. There were so many people out there being exploited by the family members who should have protected them. I wanted to give them resources, legal help, a voice. I invited Helen to serve as the foundation's first senior advisor. Her loyalty to my father deserved recognition and purpose. She cried when I asked her and accepted immediately. On the day of the foundation's official launch, Aunt Ruth stood beside me at the small ceremony. She had become a regular presence in my life, filling in the gaps of my father's history that Janet had worked so hard to erase. Ruth squeezed my hand and whispered, "Your father would be so incredibly proud of what you're doing. You're accomplishing what he never could. You're breaking the cycle of silence that poisoned this family." I understood then that I wasn't honoring my father's memory by staying quiet about injustice. I was honoring it by speaking up, by helping others find their voices when powerful people tried to silence them. 6 months after the investigation shattered my old life. My new life was quieter, but immeasurably fuller. I had Sunday dinners with Ruth, who shared stories and old photographs of my father as a young man. The father I never truly got to know because Janet kept us apart for 20 years. I received monthly updates from Helen about the Foundation's growing impact. Each family we helped felt like a small victory. Then an unexpected letter arrived, from Catherine. The handwriting was shaky and uncertain. She wrote that she didn't know if what I told her about her biological father was actually true. Part of her still refused to believe it. But she had started therapy court-mandated at first, but continuing by choice. She was trying to figure out who she really was, without her mother's voice constantly in her head. Maybe someday, she wrote, she would be ready to talk honestly. She didn't know if she could ever apologize for everything, but she wanted to try to understand. I didn't respond immediately. Some bridges take years to rebuild if they can be rebuilt at all, but I didn't throw the letter away either. I left that door slightly open, not from weakness, from the strength that comes from knowing exactly who I am and what I deserve. Yesterday afternoon, I walked out of the Foundation office into warm sunlight. My phone buzzed with a text from Ruth. Coffee tomorrow morning. I found old photos from your dad's college years. He had the exact same smile you have. I laughed softly, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Lightness. I spent 35 years believing I didn't have a real family. Now I finally understand the truth. Family isn't defined by blood or obligation. It's defined by the people who choose truth over lies, courage over silence, who choose you because they want to. I finally have that family. It just took losing everything I thought I wanted to find what I actually needed. Lindsay's story teaches us something that many of us learn too late in life. Silence is not the same as peace, and endurance is not the same as strength. For years, Lindsay believed that keeping quiet, avoiding conflict, and accepting mistreatment was the price of belonging to a family. She thought that if she just tried harder, loved more, asked for less, eventually they would see her worth. But some people are not interested in seeing your worth. They are only interested in what they can take from you. If you recognize yourself in Lindsay's story, please hear this. You deserve better. You deserve to be treated with respect by the people who claim to love you. You deserve honesty, kindness, and a place at the table that doesn't require you to shrink yourself to fit. Walking away from toxic family members is not a betrayal. It is an act of profound self-respect. And sometimes standing up for yourself is the only way to break cycles of abuse that have been spinning for generations. Lindsay's father stayed silent for 20 years, believing he was protecting everyone from pain. Instead, his silence allowed that pain to grow and spread like poison through every relationship in his family. The lesson is clear. Secrets protect abusers, not victims. Truth may be painful, but it is also the only foundation on which real healing can be built. Remember that family is not simply an accident of birth. Family is the people who show up for you with honesty and love, who choose you not because they have to, but because they want to. If the family you were born into cannot offer you that, you have every right to build a new one from the people who can. Thank you for listening to Lindsay's story today. If her journey touched your heart or reminded you of your own experiences, I would love to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever had to stand up against people who were supposed to protect you? How did you find the courage to speak your truth? Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything to us.